And today we'll go a bit rogue with a speaker that just like Laasch and me actually is on a quest to change management education. Dr. Oliver Laasch. Welcome, Oliver. The title of today's session, introduced by Oliver, is why we should stop teaching CSR and what we should do instead. Oliver is a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship and innovation at Alliance Manchester Business School and an adjunct associate professor of strategy at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. He's also a long-standing contributor to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Management Education, one of the editors of the SAGE Handbook of Responsible Management Learning and Education, and he's founder of the Center for Responsible Management Education and an associate editor of the Academy of Management Learning and Education. Warm welcome again. Glad to have you here as our final speaker in this series. And we're looking forward to a provocative contribution from your side and your ideas on responsible management education. For now, for the flow of today's session, Oliver will kick off the session with his introduction. And then after that, we'll start a conversation with him and we'll further explore the implications of what he has to offer for responsible management education. If any of you have any questions for Oliver, please make sure that you post those in the chat, given the number of people present today. And then Laasch and I will make sure that we will redirect your question to Oliver. Also, please note that today's session is recorded for people that are not able to join us live today so that they can watch it back later. Those are the practicalities. So for now, Oliver, the digital floor is yours. Would you like to introduce us to what you have to share about not teaching CSR?
Yes, which is a very strange thing after I started my academic career teaching a class called Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainable Development. So I've done it myself, of course. So thank you so much for inviting me over, Lars and Franz, and thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Of course, thanks everybody for attending today's session. It's really encouraging to see so many people, many of whom are actually old friends, and maybe some of you are just new friends I don't know yet. Very, very good to have you all. So I will just jump right into the presentation because I think most of the things that I want to say are actually in there. Let's see if I can make the technology work over here. Should have practiced by now, isn't it? After all of those pandemic months, almost years now. Good, excellent. So here we go. So why we should stop teaching CSR and what to do instead. And I want to make it clear just in sentence number 2 of that presentation. Part of this is actually a pitch for you to use my book. Okay, we've got that out of the way. But also it's not the purpose or the reason for why I've chosen that presentation topics. It's just something that I've been interested in for quite a while and was one of the main motivations that behind why we should stop teaching CSR that led to that book. So I'm trying to from here on avoid any direct marketing pitches. If I can't, I apologize in advance. So why should we stop teaching CSR? Interestingly, I actually got quite a lot of interesting feedback just after posting that title there. So Joris Lenzen, who used to be leading the Academy of Business Society, for instance, he said, "Oh, this sounds very counterintuitive. Are we actually? What do you actually mean with that? I'm intrigued. I want to come." I don't think he's here though, but let's see. But so what I would like to do is to share a couple of impressions related just in a more inductive way of getting to the topic from some things I've seen and reactions I've had to that topic. And one actually came in coincidentally just this morning by Mette Morsing, because we're organizing a panel for the UN Prime Global Forum. And part of her contribution happened to be this. So I assume she doesn't mind me showing that here because it's going to be online through the panel anyway. But what struck me there were those 3 points particularly. So we have to rewrite the textbooks. There seems to be something wrong in a certain way with the textbooks that we have. And then not focused on the cooperation and student agency. stuck out to me. So I'm trying to give you some scraps here, some bits and pieces, so that you can piece together your own version of what I want to say, hopefully. Then there's an article I really, it's a very short article actually. It's just 1 page long by Prahalat in Harvard Business Review, over 10 years old right now, titled The Responsible Manager. So he highlighted in that article how it is very much about that person and their personal practices of practicing responsible management, of managing responsibly, not necessarily that much about the corporation or about the responsible business that they work in, or the enterprise if they're an entrepreneur. And then there's a book by Ross MacDonald that has really shaped my thinking in that context as well, where he actually says, well, it is educating for responsibility, and that responsibility happens to be in a management and business context, but it's very much a personal responsibility. It's about us in managerial roles and engaging in managerial practices. I see there's something in the chat, so if there's something I need to or should consider right now, please do feel free to speak up and do interrupt me, because I can see the chat window while I'm in the presentation mode. And then something else, just I think 2 or 3 days ago, I happened to come across was this title of a paper in Organization Environment, Making It Personal. And they're talking about competences for sustainability and how that reshapes you as a person. So it is very, very much something that's not an attribute of that organization over there, of the corporation, of the business. It is something personal. And then down here, there's another reaction by Francesca, who explicitly actually allowed me to show that in the presentation. Once again, a reaction to the title itself. And she was saying, well, actually, it's not only about education and how we frame things and the type of courses we teach and how that emphasizes the organization as opposed to the person or their practices, but it's actually also about how very often those social, environmental, ethical practices or unethical, irresponsible, unsustainable ones are organized and in what context they happen. So she was saying that when working in cooperatives, because there was so much participation and shaping those practices, they became her own in a certain way. So very different from the more removed way of how she feels about CSR when she's not working in a cooperative context. So you can piece it together from there. Where am I going with this? So there's a move that I hope more and more people could make. I'm not saying teaching CSR is something that's not good. Period. I think CSR, corporate sustainability, responsible business, social enterprise, those are really, really important topics. However, I think they have been overemphasized to a degree where we actually losing sight of something that would be even more important to help people learn. And this is the idea that what we really want people to do, particularly in the UN Prime context, is to be able to learn the practice or the practices of responsible management. And something that's not like a removed organizational entity, somebody, the business or the corporation or the government is doing it. No, this is something I can do. So it is very much about making it personal and about making it practical. Those are the 2 main points that I'm trying to get across. Let's make it personal and let's make it practical. And with practical, I don't necessarily mean theory and practice type of practical. I mean, it's something that that is shaped in the process or the different practices of responsible management, practices that integrate sustainability, responsibility, and ethics. That's the type of practical I mean. So in terms of learning outcomes, also there's one important shift, I believe important shift that I hope with a move like this could come. So moving away from being that kind of distant judge of the organization, saying, okay, are they a good corporation? Is that a good venture? Towards moving towards actually learning to become a responsible manager and or to engage in responsible management practices, students themselves and ourselves as well, because in many roles we are managers as well, particularly in the academic administration context. So what actually to do instead? And this is quite a wild shopping list. I'm just gonna ride through it with you in a couple of moments so that we can get into the discussion. So the obvious thing is then, and that comes out of the title, well, replace courses like CSR, business and society, corporate sustainability, responsible business, social enterprise, with courses that that emphasize that personal dimension or that practice dimension. So responsible leadership, managing ethically, leading for sustainability, responsible management. So that's just a couple of course titles that I actually have seen that are already out there. So no worries if your course, the course that you're teaching right now, is the CSR and the business society course and so on. We're going to get to a couple of, and you don't want to, or you cannot change that. We're going to get to a couple of things that you can actually do inside those courses as well. But before we go there, I would like to think about maybe, just maybe, we can actually go where it hurts best or where it hurts the most. And this is the move I've been trying to make with the second edition of our textbook. So this idea that, and we've had that for 2 decades probably now, this point about mainstreaming, moving it into the normal courses, and as much mainstreaming the business managerial practices as also our educational practices, to putting it into the core. For quite a while I've been interested in how could we actually get that topic into the introduction to management course, or the introduction to business, or management 101, because this is where many students for the very first time shape their perspective of what management can be and who they can be as a manager, and what kind of practices they might engage in management. So for that reason, a move that we just did with the second edition was not an easy move, was actually to drop the responsible from the first title. So it used to be called Principles of Responsible Management, just very similar apart from the proposition as the UN Prime Initiative, towards a title that is Principles of Management, just a normal management course. And we still have those topics in the second title, but the idea here is actually to rethink those practice of management and who we can be as a manager, and to move it mainstream. So that might be one way of actually making this move. So that was the first one. But then we've got 2 parts that I'm going to go through, which correspond or which respond to the question: what if I actually cannot change my entire course? Or what if I don't want to? I cannot do away with the textbook I'm using right now? Or what if actually all of that I actually quite like the corporate organizational or business type of focus, but I still would like to integrate just a little bit of that thinking, a little bit of that move. So the first way I would like to recommend from my own practice is actually to move it towards cases that make that practice lens and that professional, personal lens and experience bring that much more to the forefront. So for instance, we do have those professional profile cases, actual people who talk about their day-to-day doing of responsible management. And this, of course, could happen as a live case as well. You could invite somebody to talk about that in your class. But then also another thing I like to do a lot is, and start in the classroom as well before it moved into the book, to actually tell true stories. So in this case, not the person themselves telling the story, because it might be a sensitive story, or maybe even to some degree dangerous or an embarrassing story for them. Often it's stories about where responsible management turned out to be irresponsible management, or where they want to make a change. So we do have one of those true story cases in each of the chapters of the book, where we have anonymized actual stories of people and their practices. And then, of course, you could think about full-blown cases as well. And this is very important. It's not a Harvard Business School case where you are once again taking that kind of high-level perspective of an exceptional type of event, but rather it is very, very much down to earth, and actually using the very same words and also the images, the pictures that the managers and the companies they work in have used and put out there. So once again, staying very close to what's actually happening to the practice in this case, not the practices, and also showing the people actually doing it. So it's not a removed corporation we're seeing up here. We're actually seeing people doing responsible management. So that was the first one. And the second one, I'm just having a look at my my clock, so it's not too bad actually. I think I'm going to get through it on time. So the second one is about personal competence learning. So the idea here is, and Elena Antonakopoulou, who's here as well, I believe, has been working very, very closely together with Dirk Moosmeijer and myself to develop what you're going to see in just about a moment. And the idea here is actually to move away from that organizational level of learning contents towards that very personal and embodied level of content, or of change, rather, learning as change here. And that came out of a structured literature review that we've done. We're still in the process of publishing it, so we're a little bit slow with that one, but we've used it a lot already. So what came out of that was the 6-pack idea, again, just trying to sell an idea here in a visual way, of be, become, act, interact, know, and think. So those larger 6 competence areas. And if you translate that to responsible management, how to be and become, how to act and interact, how to know and think as a responsible manager, and not to fragment it, but rather to think about how do all of those interact and make the entire person that is the responsible manager, and how do those competences relate into particular practices and particular ways of practicing. So one way of doing this is actually the dissecting. So we do have, I redid the end of chapter exercises and actually organized them all along those 6 parts of the 6-pack. So you see there's certain types of activities, of exercises, of challenges that are more related to one of them. So for instance, the interacting one here, number 10, write or respond to a social media post related to professional management, to provoke reactions and engage in discussion. So this is not your normal type of exercise. It's not very elaborate either, because we would want students, but also educators using it to still be able to add to that, to change and to make it something that's theirs, really. So this is the idea, but this is dissecting it. The idea is, how can we then put it back together? Well, one way is to actually say we do have one exercise for each. And this is the first example here of a course that I taught at the University of Tübingen for quite a number of years, which was called Competences for Responsible Management. So we move from knowing, from know to think. So it's individual exercises. We've got one on know, then we do one on think, then one on act, one on interact, one on be, and one on become. Again, rather fragmented, but overall, and they had a kind of a workbook where they would document and reflect on their exercises. But overall, we actually cover all of those different competences. But then actually much of the feedback was about, okay, this was all nice, but I like to see that in a way that's less artificial, because those are all exercises, they're not real life yet. So then we actually moved on to a different project, and this is the Coursera MOOC, Managing Responsibly. I think last time I looked about 16,000. I'm not a numbers person, I might get that wrong, but somewhere between 10 and 20 or 15 and 20,000 people have taken that course and have run through the pedagogy that we're using there. And this pedagogy basically is one of no pedagogy, or rather a problem-based pedagogy with very, very little instruction. So the only thing that students are meant to do, their learners are meant to do, is to come with a problem to the course, to use the materials provided in the course in order to start working on that problem and to document the process. And what we saw there was actually that everybody was taking a different route through those competence-based exercises. And in a more natural way, it became something that everybody was able to do without needing a lot of instruction, which particularly in a massive online course where you cannot give that personalized attention would be a problem if you're trying to kind of standardize it for everybody and press people into that pattern that we think is good. And then finally, the last version of how that could work would be to actually do something in between. So here, and that's a course I used to teach at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, where the idea was to have one exercise at a time, but those exercises would always link at least 2, most of the time 3 different areas of the competences. So in this way, we started to interweave, you see, like to make sure every time students are doing something in that class, they're building their competence 6-pack, at least in 2 or 3 of the muscles that make it. And overall, we actually train the whole thing, and we don't chop it entirely apart, but we're also not getting lost in the complexity of not having enough instructions as some students wanted to have. So we are almost finished. I just wanted to give you some more impressions. So what's nice about that is actually you can also then ask students. So this is a self-assessed representation of how students overall in the course in Tübingen thought they were their competences were progressing. Quite interesting. And something you analyzing that is even interesting for further development. So we saw that actually interact was very, very far down, because the exercise that we gave them in that iteration of the course was to use a app, a mobile phone app related to a sustainable, responsible, ethical lifestyle practice, and then actually change this particular lifestyle practice over the course of 21 days. And well, there is an individual assignment, right? So it's not surprising that this interact competence is not the one that they felt they furthered most among those. Another quick impression: student feedback. Typically, it's quite diverse, but there's two big themes in there. One is that people generally do enjoy the kind of diversity of exercises, and that it's not just a lecture and it's not just another case study, but the diversity of engaging with the topic. But on the other hand, also, there were quite a couple of people who were concerned about the fragmentation in that first iteration of the course. We would have one exercise for every competence area. And others felt there was a lot of ambiguity, because they weren't used to that kind of exercises. So they didn't quite know how to approach it and what was required of them. So they felt it was a little waste of time sometimes, to not the exercise overall, but getting into it. So this, it's not without challenges, but if you folks want to try it, I've used in faculty development workshops, I've used this form quite a lot. Just kind of one-page worksheet that you could, if you want to use in order to design your own course, or just an exercise based on that competence thinking. And if you actually want to go deeper, this paper that we published last year does have a very nice of Journal of Business Ethics, allowing us to do that. Actually does have a how-to guide, a description of that app-based competence exercise, experiential learning that I just mentioned. And that's so there's much more out there. This was, of course, just a snapshot of something I've been doing quite recently, but please don't be a stranger. If you want to engage, do reach out to me, and particularly it would be really good to see you folks in that educator group that we opened up on LinkedIn, in order to actually get more conversation going beyond nice events like this one. And also feel free to post your questions and get some community input and support possibly there if you want to join. And that's me done. I was given 25 minutes and I made it. Doesn't happen very often.
But you did. Great, Oliver. Thanks so far. Pretty insightful as well, and also as far as I'm concerned, and I'll just kick off with it, raises a lot of questions, right? And just to kind of scaffold the remainder of this session, a basic, but I think still an important question. First question, what in the end is your kind of definition of responsible management, or perhaps better, what in your opinion is the goal of responsible management? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I've put out a couple of definitions in the past, and some of them I really don't like anymore. So what I typically use, and what just recommended to one of my PhD students half an hour ago, is responsible management as the integration of sustainability, responsibility, and ethics into managerial practices. I just realized it's quite a mouthful if you actually say it and don't just read it. But that's the idea. So this kind of integrative, transdisciplinary perspective of ethics, responsibility, and sustainability, and not just putting them one by one in there, but their interaction, how they come together, how they shape new versions of practicing. If you don't just do one of them and you don't try to draw a clear line, but rather you really do practice across those disciplines. That's the one. And then, of course, the integration into the practices. And that then also gives you the purpose, of course, because that's the idea. We're hoping to have a responsible management practice, and we know that we have that if actually ethics, responsibility, and sustainability are at the very heart of that practice.
Yeah, okay, that's very clear. And what I like particularly about it is that you take kind of a practice perspective, right? But practice to practice in a verb sense.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's very an action-oriented definition, and at the same time,
it does have both. If I can just jump in there
Sure.
for a moment, because I think that's important. So it is about and also Elena, because she's written a lot about those topics. I don't want to look too ignorant here. So the practicing, of course, as you mentioned right now, the action orientation is really, really important about that, but it's equally about practices. So more kind of an entity approach, like typical practices of managing and how we transform those. So there's also the idea. So I mean, if you want to think in entities and not in actions, a move partly is to move from the responsible, sustainable, ethical corporation organization towards the responsible, sustainable, ethical practice as another entity, if you like to think in entities.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, as far as I'm concerned, it raises a question, an important question, I think, is that with that definition, with this interpretation, right, with this perspective that you have on responsible management, you do put a lot of agency with the individual, right, in the context of all these systemic challenges that we are confronted with. What's your idea about this?
Yeah, it is, because it does emphasize or implicitly emphasize something that I'm not very fond of. This idea of the hero, like the heroic entrepreneur, the heroic CEO. Look what changes he made, and how they challenged the world and so on. It's not where I want to go with it. It is rather the idea that you do not have to get it all right as an individual. You don't have to change the world. You have to be pragmatic in certain situations. I know it in myself. I'm quite hard on myself in those topics. I notice very often I can do it, although I am really, really trying very often. So I know there's a lot of pressure and a lot of struggle involved, but I think another core element of responsible management for me is this idea about the almost mundane kind of practices and practicing. It is not about changing that organization, turning around that company all the time. This is a really great outcome if it comes to that. But for me, responsible management really is about those daily iterations of how we do our job, how we manage, and how we try to integrate ethics, responsibility, sustainability. Every moment we do that, and sometimes it doesn't work, but it doesn't mean we can't try it. And I don't think we should be entirely kind of sad or discouraged if it fails us, because sometimes, as you say, it's not possible, or it's a very, very hard struggle to make it possible.
Okay, and just one final thing about this, and these will be concepts that I'm sure you're familiar with. To what extent is this idea of educating for responsible management a blend between Ausbildung and Bildung?
Interesting, yeah. So if you're saying Ausbildung and Bildung, so I'm struggling how to translate that into English. How would you do it?
Me too.
So you pass that on to me, thank you. No, but so let me see if I get right, get the distinction you're making right, without trying to put a particular word on it. So the Bildung as more something that is kind of the humanistic sense of humanistic education, formation of you as a human being, something that forms you in a certain way. While I understand Ausbildung typically is more something that's task oriented. It's something that you're learning in order to, not just for the sake of learning or for the sake of kind of changing who you are or developing who you are. Is that where you're coming from, or am I going to the wrong direction there?
No, and I was also thinking about a part of related to character building in it.
Yes. So that the character would be, once again, for you would be the Bildung, right?
Exactly.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's a core aspect of it. However, I'm struggling with this distinction, because I think it is very hard to disentangle what forms us as human being and what is necessary for the job. I think, and also this idea of the six-pack actually almost literally embodies it. That I mean, this, like having the six-pack, it keeps us stable, makes us look good, like a kind of upright human being, but at the same time also it allows us to do anything that we want to do without the kind of abdominal muscles. Like we couldn't do anything as a human being. So I feel that's a distinction that at least for me it doesn't really help. But to answer your question, I think both of them are very, very central to it. But it's not something that I would typically distinguish between one or the other, because for me the point is I want to get those muscles moving by in those competence frameworks. what I use them afterwards, well, we might find out.
Exactly, and in the end, a six-pack makes everybody look good, right?
Maybe. I lost mine a long time ago, but I assume it does.
So Oliver, maybe a question from my side.
Yeah.
Earlier, you in one of your slides you talked about old world management and new world management, and I was intrigued by that, and it made me think about John Elkington, who recalled his triple bottom line concept a few years ago. So apparently, the triple bottom line is the old world management concept. What's the one that's replacing that? There's
been a lot of discussion about that particular phrase and term and the related management instruments, hasn't it? Because there have been Michael Braungart, for instance, he then started talking about the triple top line. So it's really what comes out of it as positive effects, not what's left over and on the bottom. But I don't really think that helps us a lot. And I must admit, actually, that so I just got an email of one of the first book adopters, and he was explicitly saying, so why do we have an old John Elkington interview where he talks about the triple bottom line in your book? So probably I myself need quite a bit of updating there as well for the next edition. So I don't have a good answer there, but the general idea of old world and new world management, maybe you can find your own answer if I explain that just real quick, is that many of the managerial tools, instruments, practices have been shaped by a context that we're not in anymore. And I mean, thinking after World War II, basically, where we have abundant resources, we can, in many cases, we can just do whatever we want with many people. They're not very strong social, environmental, ethical standards in many places and situations and so on. We're running out of planet, basically destroying many of the basic mechanisms that keep us alive. So that used to not be the situation or the old world that management was shaped by. It wasn't in that kind of situation. So the underlying idea is then we need to go one by one and rethink each of the things that we're doing and each of the managerial tools that we're using in order to make them fit for that new world that we're in right now. And it is a world where many of our basic life-sustaining mechanisms are in danger. And it is a world that's very scarce in many ways, just to highlight a couple of points. So that's the basic idea, to really go one by one and to rethink what doesn't fit anymore, although most of those things are institutionalized and commonly accepted just because we've been doing them for such a long time and we haven't gone through the exercise yet of questioning. At least not to a degree that then would really lead to institutionalized change, like a different taken for grantedness, where you stop things taken for granted that you have done for decades, and you think what else could be in its place, or maybe nothing should go in its place, and we just should get rid of it entirely.
Well, actually, there's an interesting question in the chat related to this. Jorge says that we've been debating management and leadership for over 120 years, he says, and trying to find the best practices in the area. The management should be responsible by definition. So he says, I wonder if people are ready to stop thinking on their own individual needs and start thinking in collective needs, as responsible management seems to imply. So isn't responsible management demanding for a more profound change than we are actually able to do?
I don't know about ability. I really like the performativity discussion of making realities and changing what is possible and what the laws of social reality are. So even not only changing the outcomes, but the underlying laws of how social reality functions based on what we do. So I believe that is possible. And I'm not just saying anything is possible because it's a nice slogan. I really believe we can very fundamentally rewire how we work as society and what we do and how we do it, and based on what fundamental principles and ideas we do it. So I don't think it is well, maybe it is impossible, but it doesn't have to stay impossible. That's what I'm trying to say. So that's the one thought. But yeah, I must say I got a little bit lost in the performativity discussion here. Where did we start with that? Sorry.
I think we started with Bildung and then we ended up at the triple bottom line, and now we are questioning whether we can actually change everything that needs to be changed. So
right, and I, I think actually COVID is a so thinking about that, can we actually change? So if we can change, a crisis like COVID is the point where I think it is most likely to be doable. So I think what's possible also very much changes based on how the larger context develops. So Muhammad Yunus actually in an interview that we did with him said, okay, so now is the point in time. Just don't wake up the big bad machine again, because it's sleeping right now. There are many things. Leave them sleeping. Set governmental incentives that don't allow some parts of the economy to wake up, at least not in the same way that they fell asleep. But I mean, even if you missed that window of opportunity possibly now, and I don't think we have entirely, because many things have moved, I think, in that time. I'm unfortunately quite sure that there will be something like this in like every 3 to 5 years from now, because we have brought our systems to a level where the next crisis just lurks around the corner, and it could be anything, because we do have a handful of likely candidates to strike next. So there's going to be a next crisis, another standstill, where we possibly can rethink how we want to restart. Sorry for that gloom and doom. That's my
no worries, Oliver. Actually, talking about change, so one of the questions popping up in the chat is now about working in the system of education, where part of that system requires you to evaluate or test or grade students at the end of a course. So how does that work in the type of courses that you are suggesting here?
Yeah. So I assume the competence-based courses rather. Yeah, it's a tricky one, because competence, the competence framework has come originally from that aspiration to be able to measure the whole person and kind of to basically cut people apart and say, like, how well does your brain work? How well do your legs work? I mean, in a metaphorical way, of course. So in the work that Elena Antonakopoulou and Dirk Mosma and I have been doing, we're actually trying to reassemble the person. So it's not about competences as an outcome. We're not trying to help people to learn those individual pieces and then to measure them, but rather about competence overall. So that then, of course, has implications for how do you evaluate learning. One way is to evaluate through process. So the way how I did it in the course at the University of Tübingen was to evaluate their competence workbook. So they would actually reflect and document what they had done. I do not know if they have become more responsible people or more responsible managers, but I know if they've done the work, and that's what I give them the grade on, depending on how well they've done the work. So that's one, and the other one would be a very business ethics type, behavioral ethics type, action measurement type of approach. So if you were actually able to see how people do their job later on through observations, for instance, but of course that's not really feasible if you particularly if you have a large course. So we go back to the kind of apprenticeship model and the Ausbildung, like becoming able to do a certain job. So it's a tricky one, because it doesn't work very well in that kind of very strictly grading oriented context. So often I rather use it in order to structure the interaction in the course, but then very often the final piece that they're meant to hand in and that I grade afterwards will be a more traditional essay, for instance, might be a reflective essay to capture more of that holistic dimension. But there, I think there's more work to do, and the question how to possibly get there. Yeah.
Maybe another topic that popped up in the chat now, linking to responsible management, is the suggestion that if we are going to make the change to management being responsible, would it be an idea to eliminate the limited responsibility status for companies that they benefit from? So let's get rid of that.
Yeah.
If we want to have responsible management.
Yeah, I would like that very much, I must admit. Although it's also scary, isn't it? Because so the question, I think, and again, I've got no legal background to speak of at all, so I'm just making things up here and imagining what it could look like. But so the question would be, to what degree that responsibility, or that kind of opening up the responsibility for the organization also translates into opening up the responsibility for individual employees. I assume it would trickle down probably, because then the person making the decision probably doesn't have a job anymore if the organization is held responsible for it, or in other ways. But that's an interesting thought. I really like that one, actually. But it is scary in a way. If I remember back when, like a long time ago, when I was an aspiring insurance agent, imagine that. Something that most scared me in the world was, so what is happening to the people working with me, and how does what I'm doing actually affect them, if I'm doing a good job or a bad job on a very personal, close level, because I like these people a lot. So for me, it was that sense of responsibility which actually made me give up that job. And I said, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to live with this every day. So there might be an effect where people who might naturally tend to take responsibility very seriously then leave the jobs where they're meant to be responsible. So there might be that kind of quite negative effects as well, just judging from my own experience, possibly.
There's a couple of other questions still in the chat, and one is from Diego Lee. I'm not sure if I pronounced the name correctly. Diego says, in business courses, usually we teach students from executive manager perspectives. Whose approach or approaches do you keep or teach in your responsible management courses than yourself? If you use an executive approach, is that really different to a conventional CSR course, for instance? But I mean, just from your own experience here.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought. I mean, my impression is that the exec education courses are closer to what I'm suggesting there than the traditional undergraduate and still the master's courses are, probably. And it's an interesting kind of flashback as well, because the first thing I ever did with UN Prime was to co-coordinate the exec education working group back then. So maybe now reflecting about it myself, maybe that's where my emphasis of that comes from as well. It might also be a question about to what degree are we able to engage particularly undergraduate students who don't have a lot of management or practical experience in that kind of dynamic. Although once again, we do have a very big course here at the Alliance Manchester Business School, which I've been involved in quite a bit. And we do have 560 or so, almost 600 this year, undergraduate students who are just in their first semester. And it's called case studies in management. We now call it case studies in professional management to bring that societal role in. And it works surprisingly well. Students struggle a lot with it in the early stages, but by the end of the semester, they very often actually have very, very convincing and very impressive and often innovative coursework to show of how they re-envision managerial practice. And of course, they're still removed from it because they haven't practiced it themselves, but it is very convincing, I have to say. So I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's only an exec education thing that you can do. And actually, Diego, I wanted to say the article you recommend there, I've cited that quite a lot. So thanks for reminding me of how good that is. And also Sandra Weddock has written quite a lot of total responsibility management, which I think is really something that's spot on, particularly in that nitty-gritty, day-to-day, mundane type of responsibility. But anyway, I'm digressing there.
So maybe Oliver, a question that I have here is, if students in your course they focus on developing those competencies, becoming responsible managers, and so on and so on, and some of them then end up in a company, an organization, surrounded by people who have not been trained that way. How do they deal with those people? And how do you prepare them for that in your course?
Yeah. So I very much like, so part of the different competence areas is that become area, and that's typically where I see activities that address that kind of context, because the become part of that six-pack is about who you are very much on a personal level, about your values, your personal attributes, your preferences, and so on, and how those interact with your environment. That's the underlying idea there. So how do I deal with that kind of difference in like very basic worldviews very often? How do I deal with that difference in the practices that surround me. So I mean, good example, once again, me being a young insurance agent in an organization that doesn't care about responsibility at all. So what the one pedagogy that I really like most in that context, so there are many out there, but I want to highlight Mary Gentile's giving voice to values once again, because that starts from exactly that problem. How do I actually speak out and make change when I know what's right, but the situation doesn't really want me to do it? So I think GVV is really, really helpful and has been used in so many different contexts that anybody who's particularly interested in that problem, I think, will find very, very helpful guidance there.
Then maybe another comment from oh, sorry, go ahead, Laasch.
No, it's no problem, Frans. You go ahead. I'll keep this question for.
Well, from the chat. So Oliver, you talk about the way we need to have students focus on responsible management. How does that then translate into responsible management education? So what does this ultimately mean for your colleagues, other educators in the same educational institute who are working with the same students in their courses? What does this mean for teachers in the end?
In other words, what should we do here?
Yeah. So what should we do in the sense of what should we do with everybody else? Is that what you're saying? Because I assume if people are here, probably they want to do it anyway, and they're very much engaged in responsible management education, I would imagine. Yeah, I sometimes feel like I'm living a little bit in a bubble, because for some reason I never meet the people who don't do that. And I probably do live in a bubble there, just because I've been working on those things for such a long time, and I probably have been very selective and very little patient with people who don't see the world the way I do. But we do get it sometimes with particular colleagues who, so at a recent discussion where we were talking about redesigning one of our degree programs, and imagine that space for a new class had opened up, and the school's idea was, okay, let's put social responsibility in one way or another into that open space. And then you get in a group of 10 people who are also, actually most of them studying social responsibility and sustainability, saying like, oh yeah, but let's not do this again, because we do have that other, we need more quantitative methods, and accounting needs another specialized course for this or that hot topic that just came up now, and digitalization is so hot, so let's put the digitalization topic in there and forget about all that social responsibility stuff just for a moment. So and that makes me angry in a way, because it shouldn't be that personal. But yeah, how do you deal with that? I mean, typically for me, it's a very open, don't be so dinosauric. You know what in the long run counts. Just forget about those kind of short-term mini opportunities of doing something nice, and think about what we need to do in the long run. But I'm not handling these situations very well. It would be interesting to see and hear what other people, how other people deal with that. How do you do it yourself, Laasch and Frans? I'm sure you've been in those situations.
Well, perfectly honest, I have heated debates with a colleague who teaches accounting when we play golf on what he should teach instead of the triple bottom line. And to be perfectly honest, I find it really difficult to answer his question when he then flat out says, so what should I teach instead? And I don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah. I mean, we calling the triple bottom line, yes or no. I think in comparison between the single financial bottom line or purely economic bottom line versus the triple bottom line, I think we're a little bit less bad. Could it be better? Probably yes. But while we are figuring out what it is that could replace it, well, let's not fall back on the version that we already know doesn't work in this world anymore.
So count your blessings there, basically.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
How about you, Laasch? How do you deal with that?
Well, to an extent, I think it's also a matter of just ignoring colleagues. and I'm sorry to I'm sorry to say this, but actually this is part of what I do in Antwerp, of course, because I do see that despite all the initiatives that we are taking, there are still some, as Oliver called, I mean, there's kind of some prehistoric, right, management education that is being taught. And just looking with an eye on the comment from Priscilla in the Priscilla Clau in the chat. I mean, this relates to this, right? And she says, I think there's a challenge to make faculty in general, not only CSR and related faculty, consider responsibility in the way they develop programs and teach. And she says, I feel that most of the time when students leave my class, they turn off the sustainability mindset to go to the finance or marketing class. So there's some kind of cycle to break here as well, right? And this is also what I recognize from practice, right? That it's difficult to influence your colleagues in the end as well, right? And at the same time, it's also something that progresses over time. It does take time, but we've been saying for quite some decades, it takes time, right? So, I mean, just my experience, ignoring colleagues and going your own way and taking perhaps even a more radical stance, right, than you did a couple of years ago, it does make sense also from a perspective of developing faculty and challenging your own colleagues in a sense. But what do you think about this? She says, I feel that most of the time when students leave my class, they turn off the sustainability mindset to go to the finance or marketing class, right? I mean, probably it's kind of also, it's a real problem.
Yeah. I think it's just a lot of work. To some degree, I think this tension is good, because I think we need to, our students, as part of the learning process, they need to go through that translation from the responsible management course over to the finance course, and go back and forth many times to really, I mean, to train that muscle. And to be able to not just take worldviews as given, or take something take it for granted, but to be able to actively decide, what do I want to take for granted, what do I want to do, and which course is it that I start to believe, or which course is it that I decide to believe, or I want to believe. So I don't think it's a bad exercise necessarily, but obviously we would want to be the scales to be more on the end of the ethics, responsibility, sustainability courses, or rather on the mainstream courses that have those topics already integrated. So, yeah. But I actually, increasingly I see, and I get to know many people who have a mainstream course, accounting or finance or marketing or whatever, and have that deeply integrated. And the course doesn't have it in the title. Very often the course doesn't even have it in the short description, and still it's there. I think that's what really helps that normalization process, so that we start taking it for granted. We don't have to make it explicit for it to be there.
Yeah, and just before we finish this session, with an eye on the time, and also because Mette has joined us during the session, just give us some final pointers, right, to focus our attention to, also from a research perspective, because I'm sure you're working on these topics also, right? Some provocative topics. So could you give us some pointers?
Yeah, I don't know if it's provocative, but for me, responsible management as a research topic is still very much emergent. Of course, we do have all that work on CSR and corporate sustainability and business ethics and so on. But I think responsible management itself is still struggling to find its identity. And a lot of that relates back to the question, what is actually new here? And I wrote this working paper, just old wine in new bottles ? About responsible management, trying to make some of those distinctions. But I think the work that needs doing right now, and it's not very exciting maybe, but is to find out what can a responsible management lens actually give us in research that we haven't done before. And I think for me, mostly it is the management part. It's hidden in that verb management, not management as a noun. It is about the process. It is about the practices of management, less than it is about the management of the organization. And to some degree, it isn't necessarily the responsible management by the manager either, because particularly behavioral ethics has been very strong in explaining why people behave responsibly or irresponsibly. What I think we've seen very, very little is that focus on process and practices. And I think responsible management can bring that focus. And we actually, I'm working on 2 papers with colleagues that try to use those 2 lenses in order to bring that more to the forward. Apart from that, maybe a little bit more exciting and practical, I think the performativity lens that I mentioned already is one that's really interesting, because the idea that we can not only invent new management practices, so responsible management innovation is another one I think which is very exciting. So it's not only about reinventing management practices, but it is actually about going deeper towards the very underlying assumptions and socially constructed rules of how management works, and actually uprooting those and thinking which ones of those do we actually want to have. And if we don't want to have them, how do we get rid of them and plant something new in that place that nobody ever thought could grow in that soil in a certain way? So I think this performativity lens and responsible management innovation is something that's really interesting, and I would love to see more research on that. And if it's educational research, particularly the topic of business school business model innovation, I think is one that's very interesting. So very deeply rethinking what kind of business models can a business school have. And with business models, I mean value logic. So how do you create, propose, exchange, and capture value? And value could be social, environmental, economic, if you want to go triple bottom line, or value for different stakeholders, if you want to rather think in terms of whom am I creating value for. So I think those are my favorites, but of course that's a very personal flavor there. That might not be something that everybody enjoys. I do.
But it is very clear what you're saying, Oliver. And I've been looking kind of fascinated to your background. It seems like you have 2 doors on the background, and it seems pretty clear now which door we should take, right, as a community of responsible management educators and researchers. But it's already 3 o'clock. It's nearing 3 o'clock now, and time to end the session. We hope you have enjoyed this session, and also not only that this session has given you a food for thought and some ideas for the future of responsible management education, but also the entire series. Some of you have been present during multiple of these seminars, but a big thank you to all of you for joining also today, and to Oliver, our speaker in particular. Thanks, Oliver, again for this valuable contribution to our series. It was a very good ending of this series, and we definitely are looking forward to staying in touch. So with this seminar, the series has come to an end, at least the first edition. So we could see if there are editions to be followed, and with your permission, we'll keep you informed about future activities in the field of responsible management education. If you have any suggestions for topics, speakers that we could address in a future series, please let us know. So we would really value that. And Mette, thanks for the opportunity for doing this first edition of this series, and we hope to see you all next time. So also on behalf of Franz, and also on behalf of Oliver, see you next time. Have a nice remainder of the day. Bye.
Thank you.